The morning briefing room at Forward Operating Base Talon fell silent when Major Kestrel Raven Voss walked in 3 minutes late. Coffee stains marked her flight suit, and her left shoulder bore the telltale hunch of someone favoring an old injury. Colonel Marcus Webb's eyes tracked her movements with the cold precision of a predator sizing up wounded prey. The other pilots, all men, all younger, all eager to prove themselves in the contested airspace over the Zaravan Peninsula, exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their assumptions. Webb's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Nice of you to join us, Major. I trust your beauty sleep was more important than mission planning." The words dripped with the kind of contempt that had become his signature since taking command of the 47th Fighter Wing. Scattered chuckles rippled through the assembled aviators, but they died quickly when Raven's steel-gray eyes swept the room. She took her seat without a word, her weathered hands folding over the mission folder that would change everything they thought they knew about her. The briefing screen flickered to life, displaying satellite imagery of a valley that had swallowed 3 reconnaissance drones in the past week. Something was moving in those shadows, something that radar couldn't quite grasp and thermal imaging couldn't quite define. "Gentlemen," Webb began, then caught himself with theatrical exaggeration. "And lady, we have a problem." He clicked to the next slide, showing the debris field where Captain Torres had ejected just 48 hours prior. The wreckage of his F-35C Lightning II was scattered across a ridge like metallic confetti, a $80 million reminder that the enemy possessed capabilities their intelligence reports hadn't accounted for. The colonel's laser pointer traced lazy circles around the crash site. Torres claims he was engaged by aircraft displaying flight characteristics beyond known parameters, vertical climb rates exceeding anything in our threat assessment database, electronic warfare capabilities that turned his instruments into Christmas lights. He paused for effect, letting his gaze settle on Raven. Of course, pilot error under stress can manifest in many creative ways. That's when she spoke for the first time that morning, her voice carrying the weight of experience that couldn't be faked. "Permission to speak freely, sir." It wasn't really a question. Webb nodded with the confidence of someone about to enjoy a public execution. Raven stood slowly, her movements deliberate despite the obvious pain in her left side. "With respect, Colonel Torres isn't seeing things, and if we go in there tomorrow expecting conventional threats, we're going to lose good people." The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees as she continued. "I've seen those flight patterns before." The morning briefing room at Forward Operating Base Talon buzzed with the uncomfortable energy that preceded either breakthrough or catastrophe. Major Kestrel Raven Voss remained standing, her weathered flight suit a stark contrast to the crisp dress uniforms worn by the wing's administrative staff. Colonel Webb's expression shifted from amusement to irritation, the kind of look that had ended careers with a single phone call. "Major Voss," he said, drawing out her name like a wine taster savoring something particularly sour, "your service record shows a 6-month gap following the Kandahar incident. Perhaps the stress of that experience has colored your perception of routine combat situations." The words landed like artillery shells in the quiet room, each syllable calculated to inflict maximum damage. The younger pilots shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They knew about Kandahar. Everyone in military aviation knew about Kandahar, but the official reports had been heavily redacted. All they had were whispers in ready rooms and fragments of stories that grew more incredible with each telling. Lieutenant Jake Maverick Morrison, fresh from flight school with barely 100 hours of combat time, cleared his throat nervously. "Ma'am, what exactly did you see over there?" Morrison's question carried the honest curiosity of someone too young to understand that some doors were better left unopened. Raven's eyes found his across the room, and for a moment the mask of professional composure slipped. What Morrison saw in that instant would haunt his dreams for weeks to come, not fear, but the bone-deep weariness of someone who had stared into an abyss and found it staring back. "Things that weren't supposed to exist," she said quietly. aircraft that moved like they were guided by something beyond human reflexes, electronic signatures that appeared and disappeared like ghosts, and wreckage that told stories our physics textbooks couldn't explain. Colonel Webb's laugh echoed off the concrete walls, harsh and mocking. "Major, I think your imagination has gotten the better of your professional judgment. Perhaps it's time we discussed your fitness for duty." He clicked to the next briefing slide, clearly intending to move past what he considered an embarrassing display of instability. But Raven wasn't finished. "Sir, the debris patterns at the Tor's crash site match exactly what I documented in my after-action reports from Afghanistan. The metallurgical analysis I requested was buried in classified channels, but the fragments we recovered showed isotopic compositions that don't match any known aerospace alloys." The room fell dead silent. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to pause in anticipation. Webb's face had gone from ruddy amusement to pale concern in the space of a heartbeat. "Those reports remain classified for good reason, Major," he said, but his voice had lost its earlier swagger. "And I'll remind you that discussing classified operations in an open briefing is a violation of—" "Then maybe we should clear the room, Colonel," Raven interrupted, her tone carrying an authority that transcended rank structure. "Because what's hunting our pilots over the Zaravan Peninsula isn't going away just because we're too stubborn to acknowledge it exists." The tension stretched like a wire under stress, ready to snap and send shrapnel through the careful hierarchy that kept military units functioning. Colonel Webb found himself caught between his need to maintain authority and the growing realization that Major Voss might know something that could save lives. The evacuation alarm shattered the morning stillness like a sledgehammer through glass. Within seconds, the briefing room transformed from a scene of professional tension into organized chaos as pilots rushed toward their assigned aircraft. The Zaravan Peninsula had just become an active combat zone, and whatever theories they'd been debating were about to be tested against deadly reality. Major Raven Voss moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had lived through more emergency scrambles than she cared to count. Her flight suit, worn and oil-stained from years of hard use, bore the faded patches of squadrons that existed now only in memory. The 41st Tactical Fighter Squadron's Ghost Rider's emblem on her right shoulder had been bleached nearly white by desert sun and combat stress. As she strapped into her F-35C Lightning II, call sign Raven 1, the familiar ritual of pre-flight checks provided a momentary anchor in the storm of adrenaline and uncertainty. Her hands moved across the switches and displays with muscle memory earned through thousands of hours of flight time, but her mind was already racing ahead to the valley where Captain Torres had barely escaped with his life. The radio crackled to life with the controlled urgency of military communications. "All Talon flights, this is Tower. We have multiple bogies inbound, Vector 270 at Angels 15. Rules of engagement are weapons tight until positive identification." Lieutenant Morrison's voice cut through the channel, young and eager despite the circumstances. "Raven 1, this is Maverick 3. I've got you on scope, ma'am, ready to follow your lead." Raven keyed her microphone, her voice steady despite the familiar cold not forming in her stomach. "Copy, Maverick 3. Stay tight on my 6 and remember, what we're about to face might not follow the rules we learned in flight school." Colonel Webb's voice boomed across the radio frequency, transmitted from the command bunker deep beneath the base. "Raven 1, you will maintain standard engagement protocols. I will not have this wing's reputation tarnished by conspiracy theories and pilot error." The response that formed on Raven's lips was neither diplomatic nor appropriate for military communications, but she swallowed it along with the bitter taste of recognition. She had heard those same dismissive words 6 months ago, just before the Kandahar mission that had left 3 aircraft destroyed and 2 pilots dead. Her F-35's engine spooled up to full power, the familiar roar drowning out everything except the steady rhythm of her own breathing. Through the canopy, she could see the other pilots in her flight, Morrison on her right wing, Captain Alina Viper Rodriguez on her left, and Staff Sergeant David Tank Kim bringing up the rear in their formation. As they lifted off into the crystalline morning air, Raven caught her reflection in the heads-up display and was startled by what she saw. The face looking back at her belonged to someone older than her 32 years suggested, marked by experiences that had carved lines around her eyes and turned her once bright auburn hair prematurely gray at the temples. But it was the scar that drew attention, a thin white line that traced from her left ear down to her collarbone, a souvenir from the ejection that had ended her last tour in Afghanistan. The Zaravan Peninsula spread out below them like a tactical map made real, its valleys and ridges concealing secrets that reconnaissance satellites couldn't penetrate. Somewhere in that maze of rock and shadow, an enemy waited with capabilities that defied conventional understanding. The radio frequency erupted with contact reports as the 4 aircraft climbed toward their assigned patrol altitude. Multiple radar contacts were appearing and disappearing like electronic phantoms, their behavior patterns unlike anything in the threat identification manuals. What should have been a routine combat air patrol was rapidly evolving into something far more dangerous. Raven's radar warning receiver began painting threats from directions that should have been empty sky, its electronic tones creating a symphony of danger that she recognized from her nightmares. The valley ahead seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, as if the earth itself had developed a taste for aviation fuel and pilot blood. Raven 1, I'm seeing multiple contacts bearing 095, range unknown, reported Captain Rodriguez, her usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. They're not behaving like any aircraft I've ever tracked. The first visual contact came at 8:47 hours, exactly as Raven's flight crested the mountain ridge that bordered the contested valley. What Lieutenant Morrison saw through his targeting pod would be reviewed by intelligence analysts for months afterward, but no amount of technical analysis could capture the primal terror that seized him in that moment. The aircraft, if they could be called aircraft, moved with an otherworldly grace that violated every principle of aerodynamics he had learned. They climbed vertically without visible thrust, executed turns that should have torn their airframes apart, and seemed to anticipate his every move before he made it. Jesus Christ, Morrison whispered over the radio, his voice barely audible above the electronic warfare tones that had begun screaming in his headset. Raven 1, are you seeing this? Major Voss keyed her microphone with the steady calm that separated veterans from rookies. I see them, Maverick 3. Maintain formation and do not engage without my direct order. Her voice carried an undercurrent of something that took Morrison a moment to identify, not fear, but the kind of grim recognition that came with facing a familiar enemy. The lead bogey began a maneuver that defied physics as Morrison understood it, rolling inverted and accelerating upward at an angle that would have compressed any human pilot into unconsciousness. Its electronic signature flickered and danced across his radar screen like a digital ghost, there one moment and gone the next. Captain Rodriguez's F-35 shuddered as unseen forces played havoc with her flight control systems. Raven 1, I'm losing hydraulics and my navigation system just went dark. Something's interfering with my aircraft at the component level. From his position in the rear of the formation, Staff Sergeant Kim watched in horror as the mysterious aircraft began surrounding them with tactical precision that spoke of intelligence far beyond anything in their threat assessments. Ma'am, they're herding us toward the valley floor. This feels like a trap, Raven finished, her hands working frantically across her control panels as she fought to maintain aircraft integrity against electronic interference that seemed almost alive in its adaptability. I know, Tank. I've been here before. The memory of Afghanistan came flooding back. The same electronic warfare signatures, the same impossible flight characteristics, the same sensation of being hunted by something that understood human tactics better than humans understood their own. She had survived that encounter through a combination of skill, luck, and the sacrifice of two wingmen who hadn't made it home. Colonel Webb's voice crackled through the radio static, transmitted from the relative safety of the command bunker 40 miles away. Raven Flight, you are ordered to engage and destroy. Repeat, weapons free for all contacts. Raven's response was immediate and uncompromising. Negative, control. Weapons remain tight until we understand what we're dealing with. These aren't conventional threats. Major Voss, you will follow orders or face court-martial. Webb's voice carried the sharp edge of authority challenged, but Raven had moved beyond caring about regulations and chain of command. Copy, control, she replied, then switched to a private channel with her flight. Listen carefully. What we're facing has technology that's decades ahead of anything in our inventory. Our only chance is to work together and trust each other completely. The valley walls began to close around them like the jaws of some prehistoric predator, and Raven realized they were about to discover whether 6 months of nightmares had taught her enough to keep her people alive. The electronic warfare environment became so intense that Lieutenant Morrison's heads-up display began flickering like a dying fluorescent bulb. His aircraft's computer systems, designed to process thousands of calculations per second, struggled to make sense of sensor data that contradicted every parameter in their databases. Raven 1, my targeting computer is showing contacts that aren't there and missing contacts that are, Morrison reported, his voice tight with the strain of flying an aircraft that was rapidly becoming more liability than asset. I've got tone on something that's supposedly 3 miles behind me, but visual contact shows empty sky. Major Voss acknowledged with a grunt of recognition. She had experienced this same technological degradation over the mountains of Afghanistan, watching helplessly as her squadron's most advanced aircraft were reduced to barely controllable chunks of metal and ceramic. The memory of Captain Sarah, Phoenix, Martinez's final radio transmission echoed in her mind, a desperate plea for help that had arrived too late. The lead bogie, now close enough for visual identification, appeared to be constructed from materials that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its surface had the unsettling quality of looking solid from one angle and nearly transparent from another, as if it existed only partially in the same dimension as everything else. Captain Rodriguez fought to maintain level flight as her aircraft's automated systems began making decisions without pilot input. My flight computer just armed weapons without authorization, she reported, her professional composure beginning to crack. Raven 1, something is taking control of my aircraft. The realization hit Raven like a physical blow. These weren't just advanced enemy aircraft. They were harvesting control of coalition technology in real time, turning humanity's most sophisticated weapons against their operators. She had seen this before, in the classified after-action reports that had been buried so deep that only a handful of people in the Pentagon knew they existed. All flights immediately switched to manual control, she ordered, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned this lesson at the cost of friends' lives. Disconnect all automated systems. We're flying analog from here on out. The maneuver probably saved their lives. As each pilot manually disconnected their aircraft's computer-assisted flight systems, the electronic interference lessened perceptibly. They were now flying by instruments and instinct, the way pilots had for generations before technology promised to make warfare clean and precise. Staff Sergeant Kim's voice cut through the radio static with the kind of calm that came from accepting the reality of a situation that couldn't be changed. Raven 1, I count at least 8 bogies now, and they're moving in patterns that suggest coordinated intelligence. This isn't random. Colonel Webb's voice exploded across the radio frequency, his earlier composure shattered by reports from other coalition flights that were experiencing similar encounters across the theater of operations. Raven 1, what the hell is happening out there? We're losing contact with aircraft across the entire sector. Raven's response was delivered with the steady professionalism that had earned her the respect of pilots who had initially dismissed her as a political appointment. Control, we are engaged with aircraft displaying technology beyond current threat assessments. Recommend immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel from forward operating bases. The pause that followed stretched for nearly 10 seconds, an eternity in combat communications, before Webb's voice returned, noticeably subdued. Raven 1, are you saying we're facing non-conventional threats? I'm saying we're facing something that makes our most advanced technology look like museum pieces, Raven replied, watching as one of the mysterious aircraft executed a 90-degree turn at speed that would have liquefied any biological pilot. And unless we adapt our tactics immediately, we're going to lose this engagement and everyone else you send after us. The electronic warfare environment suddenly intensified beyond anything in Raven's extensive combat experience. Her aircraft shuddered as unseen forces played havoc with systems that had been designed to operate in the most hostile electronic environments imaginable. Warning lights cascaded across her instrument panel in patterns that would have been beautiful if they weren't indicators of imminent catastrophe. Lieutenant Morrison's aircraft began a slow roll to the left, his flight controls responding to commands he wasn't giving. Raven 1, I'm losing aircraft control. Something's overriding my inputs. The memory of Afghanistan crystallized in Raven's mind with painful clarity. She remembered Captain Martinez's F-16 beginning the same uncommanded maneuver moments before it dove into the mountainside, its pilot helpless to prevent the crash despite having full control surfaces and operational engines. Maverick 3, prepare for emergency shutdown, Raven ordered, her hands already moving through the procedures that had saved her life 6 months earlier. Kill your main power and restart on backup systems. Do it now. Morrison's training kicked in despite his confusion, and his aircraft went dark for exactly 4 seconds, long enough for its compromised systems to reset but short enough to maintain controlled flight. When power returned, his controls responded normally, though the electronic interference continued to play havoc with his navigation systems. Captain Rodriguez watched the procedure with professional interest, then executed the same emergency restart when her aircraft began experiencing similar control issues. That's some very specific knowledge, Raven 1, she observed. Mind sharing where you learned that trick? The question hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft, demanding an answer that Raven had been avoiding for 6 months. In the classified debriefings that followed the Kandahar incident, she had been ordered never to discuss the technical details of their encounter with unauthorized personnel. But watching her pilots struggle with the same technological nightmare that had killed her friends, she made a decision that would probably end her career. Afghanistan 6 months ago, she said quietly. Operation Nightfall. 3 aircraft lost, 2 pilots KIA. The official report lists the cause as mechanical failure and pilot error. Staff Sergeant Kim's voice carried a new note of respect. Ma'am, you survived an encounter with these things before. Barely, Raven admitted, her eyes tracking the movement of bogies that seemed to be studying their formation with scientific precision. And only because Captain Martinez figured out the system shutdown procedure about 30 seconds before her aircraft went into an uncommanded dive. The radio fell silent as her pilots processed the implications of what she had just revealed. They were facing an enemy that had been hunting coalition aircraft for months, possibly years, and the Pentagon had chosen to classify their existence rather than prepare pilots for the encounters. Colonel Webb's voice returned to the frequency, noticeably more subdued than his earlier transmissions. Raven 1, You're saying these encounters have happened before. Multiple times, sir, Raven replied, watching as one of the mysterious aircraft positioned itself directly above her flight in a maneuver that spoke of tactical intelligence that surpassed human capabilities. The question is whether we're going to keep pretending they don't exist, or start developing countermeasures that might keep our people alive. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley floor, as Raven's flight found itself surrounded by aircraft that had clearly been designed by minds that understood physics differently than human scientists. The electronic warfare environment had stabilized at a level that was merely hellish rather than impossible, but the tactical situation continued to deteriorate. What happened next would be studied in classified briefings for years afterward, though the official records would bear little resemblance to the reality experienced by 4 pilots who suddenly found themselves on the front lines of a war that officially didn't exist. The breakthrough came when Captain Rodriguez made an observation that would change everything they thought they knew about their situation. "Raven 1, I don't think they're trying to destroy us," she reported, her voice carrying the puzzled tone of someone working through a tactical problem that didn't fit any known parameters. Lieutenant Morrison checked his weapons systems display, noting that despite multiple targeting opportunities, the bogies hadn't fired a single shot. "Viper's right. They've had clean shots at all of us for the past 5 minutes. Why aren't they engaging?" Major Voss felt a familiar chill as the pieces began falling into place. In Afghanistan, the mysterious aircraft had displayed the same restraint, seeming more interested in studying coalition tactics than destroying coalition aircraft. It was only when Captain Torres had attempted to engage that the situation had turned lethal. "They're learning," she said quietly, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "They're not here to fight us, they're here to understand how we fight." Staff Sergeant Kim's radar scope showed the bogies moving in complex patterns around their formation, never maintaining the same position long enough to be targeted, but never moving far enough away to lose contact. "Jesus, ma'am, you're saying they're using us as some kind of training exercise?" The thought was both humiliating and terrifying. Humanity's most advanced military technology was being treated like a laboratory experiment by an intelligence that viewed human pilots as interesting specimens rather than legitimate threats. Colonel Webb's voice crackled through the radio static, his earlier arrogance completely absent. "Raven 1, I'm reading your telemetry data, and frankly, none of this makes sense. What are your recommendations?" For the first time in 6 months, Raven felt the weight of command responsibility settling on her shoulders without the crushing burden of institutional disbelief. Webb was finally asking the right questions, even if they had come at the cost of nearly losing an entire flight of aircraft. "Sir, we need to stop treating this as a conventional air-to-air engagement," she replied, her mind racing through possibilities that military doctrine had never considered. "These aircraft aren't interested in territorial control or strategic objectives. They're gathering intelligence on our capabilities." The bogies began a new maneuver that defied every principle of formation flying, seeming to communicate with each other through means that left no electromagnetic signature. They moved with the fluid coordination of a school of fish, each aircraft anticipating the other's movements with supernatural precision. Lieutenant Morrison watched the display with growing unease. "Raven 1, how do we fight something that learns from everything we do?" It was the question that had haunted Raven through 6 months of nightmares and classified debriefings. How do you develop countermeasures against an enemy that adapts to your countermeasures faster than you can implement them? "We stop trying to fight them conventionally," she said, an idea beginning to form in the back of her mind. "And we start thinking like they do." Captain Rodriguez caught the implication immediately. "You want to study them while they're studying us." "Exactly." Raven's voice carried a note of excitement that had been absent since Afghanistan. "Tank, I need you to start recording everything your sensors pick up, Every electromagnetic signature, every movement pattern, every tactical decision they make. The plan that began forming in that moment would eventually become classified doctrine for dealing with what military intelligence would euphemistically term anomalous aerial phenomena. But its immediate application was much simpler: survival through understanding. As Staff Sergeant Kim began recording sensor data that would later be analyzed by scientists whose security clearances exceeded those of cabinet members, the tactical situation began to shift in ways that none of them had anticipated. The electronic warfare environment that had been plaguing their aircraft for the past 20 minutes suddenly began to diminish, as if the mysterious aircraft had gathered whatever information they needed and were preparing to disengage. Warning lights that had been flashing like Christmas decorations began returning to normal operational status. Raven 1, my systems are coming back online, Lieutenant Morrison reported, the relief in his voice evident even through the radio static. Whatever they were doing to our electronics, they've stopped. Major Voss acknowledged the report while keeping her attention focused on the lead bogey, which had begun a slow climb that would take it out of visual range within minutes. Her instincts, honed by years of combat experience, told her that this withdrawal was significant, not a retreat, but a planned disengagement after mission completion. "Control, this is Raven 1, she transmitted to the command bunker. "Recommend we let them go. Any attempt to pursue or engage will likely result in aircraft loss." Colonel Webb's response came after a pause that spoke volumes about internal discussions happening in the command center. "Raven 1, you're asking me to let unknown aircraft operate freely in our airspace." "Sir, I'm asking you to recognize that we're dealing with technology that's beyond our current capability to counter," Raven replied, watching as the last of the bogies disappeared into the crystalline morning sky. "Discretion is the better part of not losing pilots." The flight back to forward operating base Talon occurred in relative silence, each pilot processing what they had experienced in their own way. The radio chatter that usually filled the return transit was replaced by the contemplative quiet of people who had just discovered that their understanding of the world was fundamentally incomplete. Staff Sergeant Kim broke the silence as they approached the traffic pattern. "Ma'am, the data I recorded. It's going to raise a lot of questions that people aren't going to want to answer." Raven's laugh carried no humor, just the bitter recognition of someone who had been down this road before. "Tank, the questions have already been asked. The problem is that the answers are classified at levels that most of Congress doesn't even know exist." As they landed and taxied back to the flight line, Raven could see the debriefing teams already assembling. Intelligence analysts, technical experts, and medical personnel, who would spend the next several hours trying to make sense of an encounter that challenged every assumption about air superiority and technological advantage. But before she submitted to the inevitable bureaucratic machinery of post-incident analysis, she had one conversation that couldn't wait. Lieutenant Morrison's education in the realities of modern air combat was just beginning, and she owed him an explanation that went beyond classified briefings and need-to-know restrictions. The young pilot deserved to understand that his world had just become a much more dangerous and uncertain place, and that the enemy he would face in future engagements possessed capabilities that made conventional military training only marginally relevant. More importantly, he needed to understand that survival in this new paradigm would depend less on technology and doctrine than on the kind of adaptive thinking that military institutions were notoriously slow to develop. The post-flight debriefing took place in a windowless conference room deep within forward operating base Talon's intelligence facility, where the air recycling system couldn't quite mask the lingering smell of stale coffee and nervous sweat. Major Voss sat across from a panel of experts whose security badges bore color codes she didn't recognize, their faces displaying the carefully neutral expressions of people accustomed to hearing reports that challenged the boundaries of credible reality. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the lead analyst from the Defense Intelligence Agency, leaned forward with the intensity of someone whose career had been built on solving puzzles that others dismissed as impossible. Major Voss, your report describes flight characteristics that violate known aerodynamic principles. I need you to be very specific about what you observed. Raven had been through this process before, in the sterile conference rooms of Langley and the Pentagon, where her Afghanistan experiences had been dissected and analyzed until the truth had been compressed into sanitized summaries that revealed nothing and explained less. Doctor, the aircraft I observed today displayed the same capabilities I documented 6 months ago, she replied, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who had learned that the truth was often less welcome than comfortable lies. Vertical acceleration rates that exceed anything in our threat database, electronic warfare capabilities that can override hardened military systems, and coordination that suggests either shared consciousness or communication methods we don't understand. Colonel Webb, who had remained silent through the first hour of debriefing, finally spoke with the subdued tone of someone whose worldview had been fundamentally altered. Major, I owe you an apology. Your recommendations about treating this as a non-conventional threat. You were right. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft, carrying implications that went beyond personal pride or military protocol. If the commanding officer of the 47th Fighter Wing was acknowledging that conventional doctrine was inadequate, then the entire strategic framework for air operations in the region would need to be reconsidered. Lieutenant Morrison, still wearing his flight suit and looking like someone who had aged several years in the span of a few hours, raised his hand with the tentative gesture of a student seeking permission to speak. Ma'am, if these encounters have been happening for months, why aren't pilots being briefed on countermeasures? Dr. Chen and her colleagues exchanged glances that spoke of classified discussions and political considerations that transcended military efficiency. The young pilot had asked the question that everyone in the room had been avoiding, and the answer would require revelations that some people preferred to keep buried. Lieutenant, Dr. Chen said carefully, the nature of these encounters has required us to balance operational security with pilot safety. The decision was made at the highest levels to classify these incidents until we could develop appropriate response protocols. Staff Sergeant Kim, who had been quietly reviewing the sensor data he had recorded during the encounter, looked up from his tablet with an expression of professional incredulity. With respect, ma'am, how do you develop countermeasures for technology that adapts to your countermeasures in real time? It was the question that had kept Pentagon analysts awake for months, the fundamental challenge that made this enemy unlike anything in the history of air combat. Every tactical innovation, every technological advancement, every strategic adaptation was being observed and countered by an intelligence that seemed to learn faster than human institutions could adapt. Major Voss leaned back in her chair, recognizing the familiar frustration that came with trying to explain concepts that military doctrine had no framework for addressing. The answer, Tank, is that you don't fight them conventionally. You learn to coexist with a superior force until you understand them well enough to level the playing field. The room fell silent as the implications of her statement settled over the assembled experts. Coexistence implied acknowledging defeat, at least temporarily, and the American military had built its doctrine around the assumption of technological and tactical superiority. The revelation that would change everything came from the most unexpected source. Captain Rodriguez, who had been quietly reviewing her own mission notes, suddenly looked up with the expression of someone who had just solved a puzzle that had been troubling her for hours. Ma'am, she said, addressing Major Voss with the kind of careful respect that preceded revelations that would make careers or destroy them. I think I know why they let us go. The maintenance hangar fell silent except for the steady hum of ventilation systems and the distant sound of aircraft engines being tested on the flight line. Captain Rodriguez stood beside her F-35C Lightning II, her flight suit still bearing the dark stains of stress-induced perspiration from their morning encounter. The assembled personnel, pilots, maintenance crew, intelligence analysts, and senior officers, waited with the expectant tension of people who sensed they were about to hear something that would change their understanding of everything they thought they knew about air combat. "They're not trying to destroy us," Rodriguez began, her voice carrying the steady confidence of someone who had worked through a complex problem and arrived at an uncomfortable conclusion. "They're trying to teach us." The statement landed like a bomb in the quiet hangar, its implications rippling through the assembled personnel with visible effects. Lieutenant Morrison's face went pale as he processed the idea that humanity's most advanced military aircraft had been treated like training aids in some vast educational program. Dr. Chen stepped forward with the sharp focus of an intelligence analyst who had just heard a theory that might explain months of baffling data. "Captain, explain your reasoning." Rodriguez gestured toward the sensor pod mounted beneath her aircraft's fuselage, its surface still warm from the electronic interference it had endured. Every maneuver they performed was designed to elicit a specific response from us. When we tried conventional intercept patterns, they demonstrated superiority. When we switched to defensive formations, they showed us vulnerabilities we didn't know existed. When we adapted our tactics, they adapted theirs to show us the limitations of our adaptations. The hangar fell silent as the assembled personnel absorbed the implications of her analysis. If Rodriguez was correct, then the mysterious aircraft weren't random intruders or enemy scouts. They were conducting a systematic education program designed to force human pilots to evolve beyond conventional limitations. Staff Sergeant Kim pulled up the sensor data on his tablet, reviewing the recorded flight patterns with new understanding. "Jesus Christ, she's right. Look at this sequence here. Every time we changed formation, they changed their approach just enough to demonstrate a counter-tactic we hadn't considered." Major Voss felt a chill of recognition as pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. In Afghanistan, the encounter that had cost Captain Martinez her life had followed exactly the same pattern: tactical challenges that had forced the squadron to adapt, followed by demonstrations of how those adaptations could be countered. "They're preparing us for something," she said quietly, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "These aren't random encounters, they're training exercises." Colonel Webb, who had been listening with the growing unease of someone whose comfortable assumptions were being systematically dismantled, stepped forward with the kind of authority that came from years of command experience. "Training exercises for what, Major?" The question hung in the air like cordite smoke, demanding an answer that none of them possessed but all of them feared. If humanity was being prepared for some larger conflict, then these encounters represented only the opening moves in a game whose rules and objectives remained completely unknown. Dr. Chen activated her secure communication device with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to dealing with information that could alter the balance of global power. "I need to contact Washington immediately. This analysis changes our entire approach to the phenomenon." Lieutenant Morrison, still struggling to process the reality that his first combat mission had actually been a training exercise conducted by beings whose technology made human achievements look primitive, raised his hand with the hesitant gesture of someone asking a question he wasn't sure he wanted answered. "Ma'am, if they're trying to teach us,